Hi everyone, welcome to Mumsu Code video guide session. In the previous video, we completed our validation test where we checked on all our input data being correct or not. If it's not correct, we kind of throw the exception by having our local exception as invalid sample and then wrapping it up into the validation exception. Okay. So I'm going to minimize this. Control M and O shortcut will minimize and show just the methods. In this particular scenario of me saving the data into the data store, I wanted just to validate if it's null. If it's not null, I'm validating if the data is valid or not. That's all. So sometimes, depending on your requirement, there will be more validations coming in. Say, for example, you have date time. You're supposed to create a record and stamp it with the created date and an updated date. In case of the record coming in for the first time, ideally, we always expect created date and updated date to be the same thing because that's the first time the record is getting created, right? So in that case, you have to always validate someone is creating a record telling the created date is July 2022, but the updated date is August 2022 when they're trying to create. So we'll have to say, hey, something is wrong. I'm expecting both the date to be same. So case by case, you will have to validate on all the scenarios that your software has to handle. So in this case, I'm done with my validations. So I don't have any more test cases to be written in the validations category. The next category that we are going to move on is called exceptions. So far, what we have done in the logic test, we said as a user, if anyone or a user or another API call or a service, whomsoever is calling my foundation layer with a valid data, I'm going to save it. If anyone who's going to call this foundation layer is going to call with a invalid data for each and every scenario, I've tested it. The third category that we are going to write test cases for is called exceptions. What are these exceptions? These category of test cases is something that is out of our control as a software, out of the user control or the caller's control. Because in this case, the caller who is calling with the invalid data. So we say, hey, fix the errors and try again. But in case of errors where the user doesn't have an action, say, for example, you have a data store, right? Let's get back to our diagram that we are talking about here. This is the diagram that we used for our validations, right? So let me, repurpose this diagram here. Let me call it out here. Okay. So now we handled something that the caller, either the user or the exposure who's calling this particular foundation layer, we handled that error. Now comes a question. From broker, you're trying to connect to the storage. Let's assume that we have a database that we are trying to connect. Generally, how do we make our connection? We pass in a username and password, right? So the connection goes out of your system boundary to an external. That's why we have a broker. Let's say this storage gives telling unauthorized, right? So the connection that's established here is this software knows the username and password that it needs to pass in while connecting. If it gets unauthorized, can you think who has to act? Does the user or the caller has to act, or the person who owns the system has to act? Whom do you think will be the appropriate person to take action?
Exception will throw, right?
Yeah, so let's say this broker is trying to connect to the storage. Storage says, hey, the username password that you gave me is not valid.
Valid, yeah.
And this exception comes back. So who will act upon it? The user, let's say you are using a website to register your COVID vaccine appointment, okay? While you're registering, it said, hey, you're not authorized to connect to the SQL. Will the user need to fix that error, or the engineer who owns the software needs to fix that error?
Software?
Yeah. So user is not in the picture who gives the username password for this, right? So when we say unauthorized, the boundary. The developer who's owning the software will come and say, oh, maybe I missed the password or the password expired. I need to reset the password, something of that sort. So these categories, which is not in our control, that comes from the external, are categorized as exceptions category. So validations is here, right? Let's create another file. Add class sample service test dot exceptions dot add dot cs. So now this is my category. This is an error because it needs a partial class, right? Now let me write a test. So I'm saying public void, and all these type of exceptions are called dependency exceptions because we are dependent on the storage. That's how we created storage broker, right? So that's a dependency. So we are going to say that this particular storage can, or the dependency can throw an error. Now you can ask, what is that? How do we identify what are the errors that we need to capture? So what is our dependency here at the first layer? Let's go to a service. So this service does some validation. That's fine. And this is all our code, right? So we have handled that try catch. And the next thing that happens is it goes to storage broker and insert sample. Let's get inside this. So what did this method do? It's saying samples.add. If you over this add, who's the owner of this? The owner comes from system collection generic, right? So what you can do is go to internet, say about system collection generic list add. So basically you can see some documentation. It says this is my parameter that I take. Add takes in an item to add it to the list. It implements this. And then these are the examples, right? What we are looking for is the exceptions that it gets thrown. What are the exceptions that it throws so we can handle it? So add X. I'm just going to try if it shows us an exception. List T. It says delivered implements. Yeah, so I'll show you another example. What I mean by that is, let's say if you're using a SQL server, like entity framework, add entity exception. So if this is the exception that we are trying to, capture and handle, I'm looking for documentation. Entity exception, exceptions, entity. So here, if I have to say save changes, SQL save changes. Returns. So here you see this, right? It says if you're calling this method returns this value and it can throw this type of exception. Now we are looking for this kind of things to capture in our code and give a meaningful message. So that's the list that you have to start looking for. Okay, what are the exceptions that I need to handle? That question is answered depending on the dependency methods that you're calling. So far what we did was we were trying to see what does this add throws. So far we have not found anything, right? Okay, now coming back to the diagram. If we have anything, we will handle it. If we don't have anything, let's say there is some error getting thrown. Instead of blindly saying error occurred, we'll have to give a meaningful message, right? So that's how we have been working in our software. So null check is wrapped into validation, invalid is wrapped into validation. So what are the things that we can do in case if it's a generic exception? Generic meaning all category of exception, nothing specific. It's not unauthorized, it's not connection error or timeout or anything of that sort. It's an exception. So what do we do? So that is called exception. It comes from system library. The same exercise that we did here. What do? We first localize and then we categorize. So how can we do that? So let's take another box. We are going to wrap this one into send backward. We're going to wrap this one. So any guesses, any idea what we will wrap this? Fail. And then the entity expanded. Entity. And then we say service exception. This is the standard of localization. So we say something has failed. What has failed? The entity has failed. In this case, my entity is sample. And it is a service exception because it's a generic exception. Now we have localized it. The next step that you will do is categorize it. We cannot put this into validation. Agreed? This is not a validation error, right? Do we all agree on that?
Yeah, because it's a redaction error, right?
Yeah, some kind of error. It's not a validation that you performed or a requirement that your software has to perform, right? So in that case, we have another bucket that is called entity service exception. So this is the standard that we say. It's a service exception. This service has some error. What is the entity that we're talking about here? That is my sample service exception. So this is the actual error that has happened in our system. We are localizing it and then we are categorizing it. So this is what we're going to see in our code. So let's get into exception. Let me resolve this one here. So I'm going to say should throw service exception on add if service error occurs and log it. Same standard that we follow for the testing, right? We say it should throw. What it should throw? It should throw a service exception. When it should throw? When we are trying to add. But on what category? Add is a generic operation, right? On specific action. If service error occurs, we don't want to throw a service exception if it is null, right? We want to throw service exception only when a service error occurs. That's the naming for the test. So given when part, so I say action, and this is going to be my add sample action. It's auto completing. Okay. And what is the actual method I'm testing? This dot sample service dot add. This time, I'm not going to pass in some input or invalid. I'm going to pass something because my scope of test is focused on handling the errors. That's why I'm naming the variable sum. So here I say sample sum sample equal create random sample. This, okay. So now this is my scope of test. I prepared something that is going to throw. It can be a valid data, it can be an invalid data, anything. I'm not worried about that data sanity because my scope of test is to throw a service error. Okay, now we need to prepare that service error. So var service exception equal new exception. So this is what we want to throw. We finished our first box. Now we need to do this box. So I come and say var failed sample service exception equal new failed sample service exception. What should this box contain? This box should take in this one. So that's why I'm going to pass service exception. Right? Next, we'll resolve this since we are continuing our chain of thought. Now I prepared this. That is my second box. That's my localized exception. Now I should prepare this one which will contain this one. Let's go do that. So here I'm saying var sample. So this is going to be my expected also, right? So expected, since you have tried 3 test cases, you're already a pro. Now you know that expected has to come. That's why I didn't wait for filling up expected. I'm filling it out right away. So expected sample service exception equal new sample service exception. And what is this one going to take? Is it going to take service exception or this exception? Which one do you think?
Failed sample service exception.
Yeah, that's right. Now we have packed things in a right way. Let's go resolve this. So these are nothing but our models, right? So let's go to our models, exceptions, and add it. Okay, so this has to be public because it's going to be detected outside. And this is going to be inherited from exception. And we need to prepare a message, right? But this time, this is getting wrapped for the general exception. So what is the type? It is this type. And we say inner exception. Yep. And the message that we want to give. So we say failed sample service error occurred. You can say contact support and then inner exception, which has the actual error, what type of error it occurred, right? Now let's try and see. We need to resolve this. Okay, now let's go prepare this one. Under the models, add class and this one. Same here. Okay, this is also going to be inherited from this. And then again, so this time, do you think this type, which is the type that it's going to be wrapped under? So this one is exception, but this is ours. What is the type of this? Is it EX or XE? That determines what we.
EX.
EX. Who created this? We created this, right?
Yes.
And this type is X. I know the confusion. It is this. Since we are passing that whatever we created, which is of this type to this, then we can remove this. Our exception. And now we prepare our message. Sample service error occurred. Contact support. So inner. All our models. Let's come here. It's all resolved. Now comes a question, which is something new, which we have not done in this piece and this piece. Here we said, okay, if I call this broker, return me this. Now what we are going to do here is someone has to throw this error, right? That's how we are going to validate if that error is getting captured and then wrapped. So that's what we're going to tell here. Who has to throw this error? The first dependency call that you have. For now, we only have storage broker. So that's why we say storage broker setup. What it should do, whenever insert sample is called, I'll come back here. Whenever the insert sample is called, what I want to do is it should throw. What it should throw? It should throw me this. Now, when should this error be thrown? You can say some sample, that's fine. But if you want the test to be truly effective, you need to say it dot is any of sample. Let's resolve this. Why are we doing this? What if I am preparing some input data with 1, 2, 3 and ABC and I'm passing in? So what this code will do is only when you pass 1, 2, 3 ABC, this error will be thrown. I don't want that to happen. My scope of testing in this test is whatever may be the data that this insert sample is getting called, I want the error to be thrown. That is why we are saying that let it be any data that you're giving me. My responsibility is to just throw the error. Now, if you go verify any other code that is following the standard, there are a lot of methods which don't do this. People just come here and say some sample, which is not wrong. The test will still run. Only thing is it's not pure. Similar to how we test this one, right? Here we are purely testing it because always we are generating random. Similarly, this test becomes pure only when you have this throws and you say, whatever it is, I'll throw you an error. Okay, now comes our validation part. The first thing that we validate is if the error is thrown. It is everything is same as whatever we have done so far in the service validations test. And I'm going to say this dot. What is the first call that happens? Storage broker. Verify. Do we say times once and times never? Any guesses?
Times 1.
Yeah, you're right.
Times 1.
Yeah, you're right. This times one is called not to insert the data, but actually, since we are throwing this, this needs to be verified. That's the intent of it. Then what are we expecting the system to do? It has to log it.
Okay.
So I'm expecting that broker.log error is called exactly once with my expected value. Same exception as expected. And this is also times once. Then our typical validation, right? So storage broker, other cause, logging broker, no other
But in
cause.
the sorry, Shri, in the
Go ahead.
validation, we didn't do the never in the log error times dot never.
Yeah, we did do that because even before calling our broker to save, the error will be thrown because data is invalid, right? If the data is invalid, why should we save it?
Oh, okay.
That's why we come here and say never. And since you brought this point, a very important thing also to consider is in this workflow, logging broker is called first and then storage broker is never called. So in the same order of calling, your verify no other calls should be. So the first one should be logging, the next one should be storage. Now, if you come to exceptions, this storage broker is called because we are throwing an error only after this call is made, logging call is made. That's why we are validating verify no other calls in the same order.
Okay.
If you see this one in any of the code, then it's an opportunity for you to do code rub, right? And sometimes you can even see that people do this, right? This is also wrong because what is the order of calling? This is the order of calling. So this should go up and the logging broker should come down. So this is the failed test. Any guesses what will be the error message? Will it say not implemented exception?
Contact the services.
So it will fail in this level because we are expecting this to be thrown, but it will say, hey, you're expecting this, but this is what is actually getting thrown because we don't have the catch block to handle this, right? So if I go here, are you able to see this? Let me do this. Are you able to see this now? So it says my expected is my outer, the category exception, but what did actually happen? This is what is actually happening. Okay, so this is a good test that we can make a commit for. So git changes. And I say this is a fail. I think now past test is all easy, which you have done already. So if I go here and I say I catch exception, What is my expected? I need to wrap this into the failed. So failed sample service exception equal new failed. And then what I need to do? Throw, create, and log. This time I'm going to call a service exception, right? Because this method I cannot reuse as it is doing a validation wrapper. And I say pass this. Now I need to prepare my method. So this is going to be sample service exception, create and log service exception. And then this is also of type exception. And this is going to be my sample service exception. And my expectation is I should log it. Log error of what? The exception. And then return this. Okay, my bad. It should be return. Because this will return and this will throw. If you throw this, then there's no point in having this throw, right? So yeah, I made a mistake in the recording. So we'll have to have it return. Okay, so now let's see if this test is happy. Run test. Yeah, it's passed. So we have done exactly what it needed. We catched the generic exception. We put it up in the failed exception box, and that box is our localization box. And then we wrap it up to the category, that is the exception. So analyze, run code cleanup, and I copy the test, and then I add it here saying pass. So we have successfully completed our foundations add sample. That's it. So push. Because after service test, we don't have anything. So service will be the last test. If at all we have any other dependency like unauthorized, something else, it will come before the service test. Now I'm going to create a pull request. So my pull requests, since there are multiple commits, it kind of gave me the user branch. So I say foundations add sample is my pull request. I don't think I have a issue here, so I'm creating the pull request. So if you take a look at the history, this is the happy path fail test. This is the happy path pass test. Then this is my main merge. Then I had my null fail test. Then I did code rub. And then this is my null pass test. Then I did invalid fail test. Then I did some code rubs. Then my invalid pass test, service fail test, service pass test. So this is the test driven approach. We are writing a fail test. We are passing it fail, pass, fail, pass. And this is the same commit history and the files checked. So what I would request you all is just take a look at this PR. If it's all good, just give me a review. You can go here and review it, and then I'll merge it. Okay, any questions?
Okay.
Awesome. So this wraps up our foundations layer. In the next video, we will be looking at our exposure layer for the add. Once we are done with it, then we will be going with our retrieve all. Okay, thank you all for watching. See you all in the next video.